Welcome to the Is It Time for a Lawyer podcast with attorney George Lamb. Each brief episode will focus on a specific legal topic to help you better understand the situation you're in and what your next steps might be. Let's join George for this episode. And friends, we are back with George Lamb, and today we're going to talk about the topic of divorce planning. George does a tremendous amount of family law work here in Louisville and surrounding counties. And George, let's jump into this. This is one of those scenarios that, there are several different situations that may arise, right? You may know you're going to file a divorce or file for divorce. Maybe your spouse has already done that, or maybe you both together have agreed, hey, it's just not working out. Why don't you kind of take it from there? How do you approach these types of situations?
Depends on the scenario. I appreciate it. It depends on the scenario, but when you're planning for divorce, it would be the same steps that you would look at as far as what issues you would try to get ahead of. One of the things that comes to mind is, what is the catalyst? Why are you planning for a divorce? And the first thing is, have you exhausted all other avenues? In other words, have you tried counseling? Have you tried therapy? That's a personal decision. It's a personal decision as a couple. It could be individual to that extent, but the first thing you want to try to determine is if you're going to go through with it. And it only takes one. It doesn't take two people to get divorced in Kentucky. It's a no-fault state. It only takes one person if they want to go that route. You would always have to consider the emotional impact of it. How would it affect you? How would it affect your spouse? If you're the one thinking about it, then obviously that's emotional for you. The other person may not know. But at the end of the day, it's going to be emotional either way, and then you kind of have to balance it. So if you stay in the situation, what's the emotional impact there? If you're moving on from the situation, what's the emotional impact there? Then you would have to think, how does it affect other people? Because then you have outside people that are close to you that would be affected. If you have children, your extended family, there's all these things that add to that situation. And so that's the first thing you would want to look at. And then as you move on, the question is, when is it time for a lawyer? And that can depend on a couple things. First, if you know that you're going to proceed with a divorce, you would probably want to engage an attorney sooner rather than later. If you're surprised, odds are your spouse has already engaged an attorney, and then you probably need to engage counsel rather quickly. So what you would want either way is you want to be ready, and you want to have somebody in your corner to advocate on your behalf and also help guide you through the process. And so one question that comes up is, and this happens a lot, is people say, can we have the same lawyer? I don't think that works. I represent one person. That doesn't mean that each person has to have a lawyer necessarily. I mean, you can have some situations where you don't, but I, for instance, would only represent one person because I have a duty to a client, not clients, because it is adversarial. You can agree, and you can have it where some people understand it to be uncontested to a certain degree. But just for example, I would only represent one person.
And that makes sense because I think a lot of people, you can make a lot of headway if you both know the divorce is coming. There are some things you can agree on ahead of time, but from time to time, there's going to be that issue that trips everybody up. Hey, we didn't think about that, or maybe we didn't really think through that. Or now that we're actually in the process, now it's getting a little bit more emotional, and those handshake agreements that you had walking in may not still be intact. And so that's a balancing act that you as an attorney are going to have to help counsel your client on.
I would agree with that. I think that people do their best to try to make it as easy as possible to work through this situation. Where people run into difficulty is that they made what they thought were correct decisions without really knowing how those decisions, the legal effect of them. They don't necessarily know their legal rights. They don't necessarily know their legal responsibilities. And so you can try to have a framework, but you will need an attorney to help either guide you through it or finalize or however you want to do it. So when you're in different issues affect different couples, different families. For instance, some people don't have children. That's not an issue for them. some people have children. And so one of the questions people ask me in planning is, well, what do we do about the kids? And the answer is you handle them delicately. You have to handle kids and the information that they get and what they see and what they hear. That has to be delicate. It has to be age appropriate. It may depend on the number of kids you have, how they interact with each other, how they interact with each parent. But what you want to do, to the extent that you can, and it just makes sense, is you want to shield them from it. They don't need to, just because they're your kids, and you do have I think you have a responsibility to be honest to your children, but it does have to be age appropriate. And you need to protect them. They are in the middle, and I've heard judges say that kids are in the middle just by the operation of the situation, but that doesn't mean that they have to know everything. There are adult matters and there are kid matters. And so you have to be very judicious and very responsible when it comes to how you want to address these things with your kids. One of the next thing that comes up generally is finances. And so when you're trying to plan this, and if you know that it's going to happen, it's one thing, or if you both know, or even if you don't know, one thing you have to think about is, okay, this is going to have an emotional impact, and then there's going to be a financial impact, which can, of course, be emotional. But the first thing you want to think of is kind of at a micro level, food and shelter. I have a certain amount of money coming. We have a certain amount of money coming in a month. There's a certain amount of money going out a month, and how are we going to address that? And then you have to look at it. Okay, I've been with somebody, and you have two people and two incomes together, and now you're going down to one. And how's that going to work? And is it going to work? And what might you need to make that work going forward if there's a disparity in income, or maybe you make the same amount of money, but you kind of want to look at those type of finances at a micro level.
Well, I think one of the things that you do well is you help the client to set the right expectations, because sometimes they may think, well, it's going to play out this way. It's got to play out that way. To your earlier point, they don't necessarily understand the law and the law here in Kentucky. But I think in this pre-counseling stage, in this pre-planning stage, you can kind of help them understand, no, that it's probably not, you're not going to get everything you think you're going to get necessarily. There's going to be a give and take here. There's going to be a balance. And sometimes I think setting the right expectations with your client is going to be very helpful for them. They may not like to hear it at first, but I think they'll understand it as the process rolls out.
That's absolutely true. And so when you look at, it's pretty easy to figure out, or, you can lay out, like when I was talking about like monthly finances, you kind of know what you need and what you're doing. But then when you look at it at a macro level, and this kind of goes to your point, expectations. So when you look at a macro level, you want to look at your asset portfolio as it is, big picture things. Do you own real estate? Do you have financial accounts? Do you have a retirement? All these things, and they'll have to be divided. On the other side of it, what debts do you have? What liabilities do you have? Are they all your liabilities? Are they all your assets? It could be that you brought assets to the table before you were married. It could be that there's some debts that were brought to the table before you were married, or they're only your debts. And so when you start to unpack the financial aspect of it, you kind of need to look at it, on a day-to-day basis or a monthly basis, and then you need to look at the entire thing. When it comes to, and then there's other financial issues. It kind of touches on children if you have them. Is there going to be child support paid? How much is it going to be? Is there going to be maintenance or alimony? Is that part of this equation? And so when you're going through that, when you're trying to pre-plan, documentation is very important. And so, not many people get monthly statements every more to their house. Everything's more paperless than not. So who's the person in your family that kind of runs the checkbook, if there is one? There used to be there's a check register. Now there's not. So do you know where all your accounts are? Do you have passwords to them? Are you able to come up with documentation that you need, because you're going to need it later? You're going to have to have snapshots or more of all of your assets and all of your liabilities, so somebody can guide you through the process. And so then you're talking about legal rights and responsibilities with respect to your specific financial situation. And so one of the more important things is, if you're the person that's running the checkbook, it's going to be easier for you than if you're not. And so then you're going to need somebody to help you. You're going to need somebody to try to help you get that information if you don't have it, or you want to get that information before it disappears. And so you need to protect yourself, and a lot of it is about trying to, at least in the beginning, trying to get this information together so you can set the table to figure out how that's going to go forward.
No, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, it's a complicated situation, maybe a little bit more complicated when you actually get into the nuts and bolts of it than somebody might imagine up front. And that's, again, the value if you have the time to do this planning process that we're talking about today. It can, again, show you, oh, yeah, I need to go find that information out. Okay, that's going to be relevant. I didn't think about that. Maybe I need to think through this a little bit. Maybe there's a way that my soon-to-be ex-spouse and I can reach an agreement on some of these bigger issues. It's possible. I mean, it's definitely possible. But, again, unless you know the questions to ask, you may be totally unaware of it. And if your spouse already has counsel, there's a chance they're already planning to ask you those questions. So, again, being prepared is half the game here, I would think.
It is, very much so. As far as you're going to have questions as to what happens and how this fits together. And so there's certain parts of the process where all this information goes in. You take biographical information, you take financial information, you take your familial information, and then you try to figure out how, you kind of have to try to play it out. How do you think this is going to be going forward, not in the situation you're in now? And we'll touch on this later. For instance, if you have children, you have to figure out where they're going to be when, how you're going to do it. And that depends on their ages.
The whole logistical issues of dealing with your kiddos, getting them to school, getting them to practice, getting them home, what do you do in the summertime? All that different stuff. And interestingly enough, in episode 4, which is going to be coming up next, we're going to talk about custody and parenting time, and that'll be a deeper dive into that specific topic.
That's true, and we'll get into that in a later episode. But one of the and I agree with that, and that there'll be an episode devoted to that because it's so important. But you need to try to document as much as you can. But a real challenge is getting the information, and you have to be careful as to how you interact with your spouse, because not everything is going to be a discussion. Once this is on the table, things change. Once somebody says they've engaged in an attorney, things change. Or you know that it's going to change, and once you're talking about moving on or moving forward, the dynamic within your household is by definition going to change, and the communication that you're going to have with that person is going to change. It might be less verbal communication. It might be more written communication. It could be text. It could be emails. It could be something. It could be that you used to speak very informally, but now all of a sudden it's becoming very formal, and so it could be that you need to be very careful as to what you might put in writing with somebody. Or you may want to document discussions that you're having in writing because you might need them later. But you need to be careful about how you document everything. You need to be careful about financial transactions. You need to know important dates that happen. You need to know, kind of what your familial and financial history is. These are things that are important. Other things that are important is you need to take care of yourself. This is difficult. And so what happens is that you can get so immersed in, at some point you're going to have a case, and some people get very immersed in it, but you need to take care of yourself. And so how you do that is you seek help when you need it. That's what you do. And so that could be emotional support. That could be, support from family, support from friends. There's a lot of steps in these things, but once you're in a divorce situation and you know that it's happening, you have to be ready for certain things. You have to be ready to negotiate. Maybe you're gifted and you're a negotiator and you're ready to do that on your own. Maybe you need help doing that, but that's what's going to happen. You need to prepare for life after your divorce. You need to kind of picture how's this going to be later, and that has to do with your kids. That has to do with finances. That has to do with all those things. It's a whole host of things because it's going to be different. Just by way of example, wherever you live, somebody's not going to live there anymore. If you have a child, that child's probably not going to live there the same amount of time that they did, and so there's just going to be some normal day-to-day human changes that you'll have to prepare yourself to adjust to.
Well, I think this would be even more difficult if one of the married couples is actually a stay-at-home spouse. Now wait a minute. Now I've got to think about getting a job potentially. Now I've got to think about, do we have two vehicles? Probably, but in some cases we don't. So, okay, all of these different things, the really basic mechanical things that have to be figured out, because now you've got, okay, I've got to maybe rent an apartment or buy a second house. Okay, who's going to pay for that? We got insurance. We got all this other stuff. A lot coming at you really, really quickly in a elevated emotional, situation, and it's not always easy. So I think, doing pre-planning, if you have the capability of doing it, if you have the timing there before someone actually decides, okay, I'm filing today. Sometimes that conversation can be very helpful from a mindset standpoint.
Agreed. It kind of comes back to what we first touched on in the beginning. Who knows? And so and there's three scenarios. You're both talking about it, and you know what's happening, and you have the ability to kind of slow it down and plan. Okay, that's one scenario. Another scenario is you know that you're ready to move in a different direction, and maybe the other person doesn't, and maybe that's because they're either not listening or you can't talk to them on that level. So then and you have the ability to set up your plan, and then they don't know that it's coming, and so then they're caught by surprise. Either way, if you're the person that can do the planning because you knew it was coming, okay, you can take these steps, and that makes sense because you're planning it out. If you're the person that you're just caught blindsided, you would probably need to engage an attorney rather quickly because that person's already setting the table. And the unique part about divorce cases is that it's litigation where you know the opponent. You have a personal relationship with them. You might know them better than anybody else. You know that person. So you have familiarity with the person, but it's very emotional. And so there's a balance between that. And so and then of course, if you both are trying to do the best you can, as you pointed out, to agree on what you can agree on, maybe that works. But you still need somebody to check that out and make sure you're doing what you're supposed to be doing. And that can work, but there may be one or two things that you just can't work out for whatever reason. And so you would still need some help. You would still need some help from an attorney or professional to try to work out the last part of it.
That makes a lot of sense. George, I'm assuming you've done this many, many times over the last 10, 15 years. If someone wants to set up an appointment with you and just kind of go through this process and understand what they need to be thinking about, what's the easiest way for them to do that?
The easiest way for them to get a hold of me is my cell phone. My phone number is 502-640-9797. You can call me. You can text me. You can email me at george@lambandlamb.com, LAMBANDLAMB.com. I'm happy to talk to you, give you advice as to how I can help with your situation.
Outstanding. And friends, the next episode, as we'd mentioned earlier, is going to focus on custody and parenting time. Lamb and Lamb has a Facebook page, and right now we're posting these episodes up on the Facebook page. So if there's a few that you want to catch up on, feel free to go back and look at it there. You can also find the podcast out on Spotify, iHeartRadio, Apple Podcasts, and a whole bunch of others. So we'd definitely invite you to do that. But George, I know you're busy. I know you're running. So thanks for your time today. And we look forward to talking to you again here in about 2 weeks.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Take care. Bye-bye. Thank you for listening to the Is It Time for a Lawyer podcast with attorney George Lamb. We hope you found the discussion informative and helpful. The comments George made are not meant to be legal advice. Listening to this podcast does not establish an attorney-client relationship. However, if it is time for a lawyer, George is ready to listen. Be sure to share this episode on your social media. George will be back in 2 weeks with his next episode. Thanks again for listening.